Before we begin, I'd like to start with a Bible knowledge quiz. I want to ask you a question, and if you win, that's great, and if you don't, there's no penalty. So here is the quiz. Here's the question. What is the sin of Sodom? What is the sin of Sodom? And was God justified in punishing Sodom for that sin? Think that over for a moment and ask yourself, what is the sin of Sodom? So, all right, got your answer? Jeopardy theme here. Are you ready to find out? Let's find out what it is. Well, according to the book of the prophet Ezekiel in chapter 16, the sin of Sodom is this. He writes, "This is the sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters," so the town of Sodom and the surrounding regions, "she and her daughters were proud and had plenty to eat and enjoyed peace and prosperity. But she didn't help the poor and the needy." This is the sin of Sodom. And if you thought the sin of Sodom was something else, well, now you know more than whoever told you that the sin of Sodom was something else. So there's all kinds of surprises in the Bible, and I commend it to everyone. It's an interesting experiment to find out what the Bible actually has to say instead of what people think the Bible has to say. So we're going to begin with that idea that there is a sin that is the sin of Sodom. It is to have to be proud, to have plenty to eat, and to enjoy peace and prosperity, but not to help the poor and the needy. Today we are concluding this conversation we've been in. We've been in a conversation about the ills in society, but really from the perspective of Christians, which is how can we show the love of God in a society that is hurting? What can we do as Christians to show God's love in this hurting society? And the reason is because society is hurting. We began by looking at the sin of racism. We talked about that a couple of weeks ago, and if you didn't see that, you can watch it online. And then last week we looked at the way that we relate to the civil authority. What does our faith tell us about the power of the government to police our society? How do we relate to police? And in particular, what does our faith tell us about police when the police are violent, when there is violence from the police? So we looked at those two questions already, and today we're going to look at the question of economic inequality. What does our faith tell us about economic inequality? So the reason is obvious because it is a contributing factor, or it certainly seems like it must be a contributing factor to some of the other problems we've been talking about. It's certainly associated with higher rates of crime and that in turn leads to higher rates of policing. But it has a wide swath. It cuts a wide swath, economic inequality. In fact, just earlier this year, we saw that economic inequality is implicated in the number of people who die from COVID-19. Earlier this year, somebody compared the outer borough of the Bronx with the borough of Manhattan, and they found out that even though they're pretty similar in population, there were twice as many deaths from people who live in the Bronx. And the reason for that is that the average income in the Bronx is half of what it is in Manhattan. Because people are poorer, they live in more crowded conditions, and they have to ride the subway longer. And we've heard about the way the subway was one of the places where the virus really transmitted. So for various reasons, economic inequality leads to really terrible outcomes. That the actual death rate from this pandemic was twice as high for people in a poorer community. So we understand that economic inequality has real implications for people. And so the question is, what are we as Christians called to do about it? And one of the things that we know is that after 50 years of the war on poverty, there's still work to be done. We've been involved in the war on poverty since the mid-1960s, and what we've learned is that there aren't any easy answers. Or I should say, because there certainly has been some progress, I should say that the easy answers have done all they can do, and now we're finding the answers are increasingly difficult, that we're having to do more work to get less of a change. So in the 1960s, our country had about half the population it has now. So since then, we've doubled in population. And there has been progress, because as a percentage of our population, the amount of poverty has actually dropped. In the 1960s, the poverty rate had about 40 million people living in poverty. And today, as a percentage of the country, we have about the same number. We have 40 million people, which is only half as many because we've doubled in population. So we have had some progress. But on the other hand, during that time, the size of the economy grew by a factor of 3. So the number of people increased by 2, but the size of the pie increased by 3. And so we might ask, well, how come we didn't see that same kind of reduction in poverty? And not only that, but we have quadrupled our spending on low-income people in who are benefited by low-income programs. So we've increased our spending, and in fact, today we're spending about $1 trillion a year, $1 trillion in means-tested programs, and we still have 40 million people. So 40 million people is better than 80, which would be the number if nothing had been done, but it's worse than 20 or 10 or none. So we have learned that the easy answers seem to have used up all of the easy answers, and now we're finding that the answers are harder and harder to come by. So what does our faith tell us about this problem? What can we as Christians contribute to the conversation about economic inequality in our society? Well, there is a great story in chapter 16 of Luke's biography of Jesus, and we're going to look at it today because it speaks directly to the questions related to income inequality. So it's in chapter 16 of Luke's gospel, and it tells us, Jesus begins, this is in verse 19, he says, "There was a certain rich man who clothed himself in purple and fine linen, and who feasted luxuriously every day." So we don't know who this rich man is. We don't know what his name was. We don't really even know if he was a real person or if Jesus is telling a parable. So he may mean, imagine a rich man. So it's either a parable or it's a story, or it's a true story, a historical event. We don't know, but Jesus is using this to illustrate a point, and we can learn what he's got to say regardless which one of those it is. And what does he tell us about this rich man? Well, again, he doesn't tell us the man's name, but he does tell us that he wears purple and fine linen. So purple was very expensive to make in those days. So today that would be like saying he wears Armani suits. He's got a closet full of Armani suits, and his wife has a closet full of Gucci bags. So he's well off. He's rolling in money. And we will miss the significance of what Jesus says if we just go, okay, he's very well off. What we have to appreciate is that Jesus is setting his listeners up, because in the first century, they would have understood that to mean this guy's the protagonist, this guy's the hero of the story, because we know he must be a good guy because God has smiled on him. He wouldn't be rich if God hadn't blessed him, if God hadn't shown favor to him. Why would he be rich? And that's really the way people would have thought about it in the first century. We lose a lot of that today because we've had the influence of this story and some of the other teachings of Jesus over the last 2,000 years. But that would have been the understanding in the first century. And we still have echoes of it in our own society. For example, if you think of the word fortune, he made a fortune in real estate or something. He made a small, anyway, I'm not going to go there. So the word fortune, it means a pile of money, right? But it also means good luck. It means that luck or chance or fortune has favored you. So that would have been very much the mindset in the first century, that this rich man, he's the one we got to keep our eye on because God has been favoring him. That's how he got so rich. So that's the place Jesus begins with. And then he goes on and he says, not just the fancy clothes, he says, he feasted luxuriously every day. Now, the interesting thing about that point is Jesus says it's every day. Jesus doesn't have a problem with people eating luxuriously. Christianity and Judaism before it were characterized by regular feasting. There was a pattern in the religious calendar, and people feasted from time to time. But this man feasts luxuriously every day. So there's nothing wrong with feasting, and in fact, we see in the descriptions in the Bible where it talks about the age to come. When Jesus returns and completes his work of salvation, he ushers in this new age. One of the things that will characterize it is that the divine banquet, the people will sit at table together in the kingdom of God. We read about choice meats and fine wine. So we understand that Christianity is not saying there's anything wrong with wealth or feasting. The problem is that this guy does it every day, and there's somebody else who can't. There's somebody else who can't join the party, because Jesus goes on and tells us about another man. He says, at his gate lay a certain poor man named Lazarus. So, and remember, in the first century, our perspective is, okay, well, that's the guy that God is frowning on. That, he must have gotten poor for some reason. He must have done something that got him on the wrong side of God. So that's why he is laying there in the gate, because he's being punished for his sin or something like that. That would have been kind of the mindset of that first century audience. And he's not only poor, but he's covered with sores. And I think this is a place where we need to be honest and ask ourselves, do we want this guy to come sit down next to us? Really? And if we're okay with him sitting next to us, how about if he moves in? How about if he becomes an in-law? We see him at all the holidays. Are we really happy with that idea? Jesus has placed this picture of somebody that we would find difficult to embrace. And he says that Lazarus, this poor man, longed to eat the crumbs that fell from the rich man's table. Instead, dogs would come and lick his sores. He didn't get the crumbs. That instead, he sat out there by the gate. The rich man feasted luxuriously every day, and all he got was dogs. And in the first century, in that culture, dogs were not a happy thing. That dogs were scavengers, roaming the village, and he doesn't even have the strength, because he can't even eat crumbs. He doesn't have the strength to fend them off. So the dogs come and they lick his sores. And then Jesus goes on. He says, the poor man died, and he was carried by angels to Abraham's side. And at this point, we kind of can't understand what Jesus is saying. How could that possibly be? Not only that, the rich man also died, and he was just buried. No angels, no Abraham. He just got dumped in a pit. And at this point, I like to imagine Jesus drops the mic. That's it. He has completely challenged everything that his audience can conceive of in the area of money and economic inequality. He's gone to the very basis of their thought life about money. Jesus says that the wrong man goes to heaven. The wrong man goes to be with Abraham in eternity. And I think the evidence of this is that he spent 4 verses setting this up. And then he spends the next 9 verses explaining that, because the rich man is puzzled. He's like, how did I wind up here? Father Abraham, and he goes on, and you can read the story yourself. I don't want to pursue it because honestly, it is a distraction to us. I don't know if it was a distraction in the first century. Maybe they found it helpful to explain it. But for us, the problem is we get into questions about where is Hades and how far is it from heaven, and there's kind of some curious type questions that could distract us from Jesus's point. Jesus is talking about money here, and if we go down, what's the nature of the afterlife and where do we go when we die and things like that, we're missing what Jesus has to say about money, and particularly about economic inequality. All through this chapter, he's been talking to people about money, and he's still talking about money, and we don't want to lose sight of what he's saying. The one hint we get, if we read the rest of it, we read that he asks for Abraham to send someone to warn his family so that they don't make the same mistake he does. And Abraham says they have Moses and the prophets. He says they have the Bible. They can always go read Moses. They can read the first 5 books of Moses, and they can read the rest. They can read the prophets. They can do that anytime they want to. That's the only hint we get. What did this guy do wrong? Well, the answer is in the Bible. So what did he do wrong? Now, we may be curious. If you're not a Christian, maybe that's all you are. You're kind of curious where in the Bible is that, or what was Jesus getting at. But if you are a Christian, if we believe that Jesus is actually the Lord of heaven and earth, then it's vital for us to understand what he's getting at here. And the reason is because we're the rich man. I'm the rich man. You're the rich man. This is the internet. I don't know who's watching, but you're almost certainly the rich man. You are that person. In this story, you are not Lazarus. Almost certainly. Let me illustrate this. I want you to imagine getting a drink of water. Okay, got that in your head? How far did you have to carry it? Was it under a mile? Yeah. Did it give you dysentery? Yeah. So that's what I mean. For most of us, we are so rich we cannot imagine what it means to be poor. So we are rich. Most of the people in this congregation are probably in the top 10% of global wealth. And if we own a home in Anchorage, then we're probably in the top 5% because we are rich. We are this rich man. We're rich by historical standards, of course. If you've got a microwave oven, if you've ever used a microwave oven, then you're rich by historical standards. You're watching this message on the internet. Compared to people in history, that alone would make us rich. But we're also rich compared to ourselves. If you're more than about 30 or certainly 40 years old, you're rich compared to yourself. You're rich both because your career has progressed, but also because your money goes so much further. If you bought a 21-inch TV in 1965, it would have cost you, in terms of today's purchasing power, that 21-inch color TV would have cost you about $5,800 in equivalent purchasing power. That's how much the price. You can go to Costco today, and they just don't have a TV that expensive. You can get in the 4 digits. You can maybe find one for $2,500 or $3,500, but you can't find a TV so colossal that it costs $5,800. So we're rich. We're rich compared to ourselves. We're rich compared to most of the people who've ever lived on this planet. And we're rich compared to a lot of the people who still do live on this planet. And that's why we need to understand, what did the rich man do wrong? What was his sin? What does he need to find when he looks at Moses and the prophets? Well, the answer is that Lazarus wanted only crumbs. Lazarus was poor like we can't imagine, first century poor. And all Lazarus wanted was the crumbs that fell from the rich man's table. And the rich man didn't help him. The rich man could have. These are crumbs falling off the table. He could absolutely have helped him, and he didn't. See, what he did wrong wasn't an act of commission. He didn't commit a wrong. What he did is he omitted to do right. The rich man did wrong by not doing good. We see this in Moses and the prophets. The prophet Isaiah records this. God speaks to him saying this, "Wash and be clean. Remove your ugly deeds from my sight. Put an end to such evil. Learn to do good. Seek justice. Help the oppressed. Defend the orphan. Plead for the widow." That it's not enough to say, I come to church, I don't do anything that's bad, and here I am, aren't I a good Christian? Through the prophet Isaiah, God says, yeah, but have you done anything good? Did you seek justice? Did you help the oppressed? Did you defend the orphan? Did you plead for the widow? Because that's what doing good is. In the New Testament, the Apostle Paul writes a letter to Timothy, and he gives him this instruction. He says, hey, there's some rich people in your congregation, Timothy. And so we should listen because, remember, we are the rich people in that congregation. He says, tell people who are rich at this time not to become egotistical and not to place their hope in their finances. In other words, not to be like this rich man who says, I'm the hero of the story. God has blessed me because I am so awesome. I wear nice clothes. That's probably even improving God's like for me. He says, don't be egotistical. Don't put your hope on your finances, which are uncertain. Instead, Paul goes on, he says, they need to hope in God, who richly provides everything for our enjoyment. Tell them to do good, to be rich in good things they do, to be generous, and to share with others. This is straight through from the Hebrew Scriptures all the way through to the New Testament. It is not enough to not do wrong. That we have, as believers, a positive obligation to do good, to actually be rich in good deeds. That's what Paul tells us in his letter to Timothy. So, that's our responsibility. That's the way that we can show God's love in a hurting world, in a world filled with economic inequality. What we can do is we can do good. We can plead the case of the widow. We can defend the orphan. We can assist the oppressed. These are things that we are called to do. Now, I want to make two points before we move to application. So the first one is this. Christianity does not tell us that we need to help people who don't need help. The idea here is not that you have to do things for people who can do for themselves. In the second letter to the Corinthians, Paul says this, it isn't that we want others to have financial ease and you have financial difficulties. That's not the purpose. The goal is not just to say, you've been rich, now you should be poor, and teach you a lesson or something like that. He's not saying that we need to just help people who can help themselves. He says, instead, at the present moment, your surplus can fill their deficit, so that in the future, their surplus can fill your deficit. In this way, there is equality. He says some people, for whatever the circumstances were in Corinth at that time, he's saying that it's not so they can lay around. It's because they can't do anything but lay around. Whatever the circumstances, we don't know the details, but he's saying it's not about them relaxing. It's about you being able to help them through this crisis. And then someday when you're in a crisis, they can help you. So he says in that way there is equality. And Paul he uses even stronger language when he writes to the church in Thessalonica. He says this, he says, even when we were with you, we were giving you this command. If anyone doesn't want to work, they shouldn't eat. So Paul is not saying that you need to support people who just refuse to work. But he is saying if people need help, then as a Christian, it's our responsibility to help them. So that's the first point. We don't need to help people who don't need help. But the other thing is, Jesus didn't tell us to stop with crumbs, right? The Lazarus would have been happy with crumbs, the crumbs that fell from the rich man's table. That would have been fine with Lazarus. But Jesus didn't say you should stop there. Jesus tells us instead to think about how it would land on us. Jesus tells a great story earlier in Luke's biography. He tells us about a man who invited Jesus for dinner and then basically gave him the cold shoulder, was very grudging, didn't provide him a proper welcome, didn't give him the lotion that people would put on when they came into a house, didn't give him water to wash his feet. He basically gave Jesus the cold shoulder. But then a woman comes in, and we don't know what her story is, but she begins bathing Jesus's feet and wiping it with her hair. And that sounds very awkward to me, but Jesus looks at his host and says, "You gave me the cold shoulder, and she's giving me the treatment that comes out of gratitude." And he says this, he says, "I tell you that her many sins have been forgiven. She has shown great love, but the one who is forgiven little loves little." So yes, Lazarus would have been happy for crumbs, but Jesus doesn't tell us to stop with crumbs. And in fact, he tells us the golden rule. He says, you should treat people in the same way you want people to treat you. This is the law and the prophets. So we don't have to stop with crumbs. So that's what Jesus has taught us. He's taught us that despite our expectations about what it means to have a fortune, it doesn't mean that God is smiling at you. It means that God has given you a vocation to help people who don't have a fortune. So that's the first, or that is the lesson here. And now I want to move on and look at some applications for this. The first one is Jesus is talking about a real person. This rich man has a poor man laying at his front door, right? He can't go out of the house without tripping over this guy. Lazarus is not an abstraction. He's not the poor somewhere. He is a real person, and he has real needs. He wants some crumbs from the rich man's table. He's got something wrong with him that makes he's got a skin condition or whatever it is. He's got sores. He needs medicine, whatever the first century version of medicine was. He needs help. He's got real needs. He's not an abstraction. So we should be thinking not in terms of systems and structures. We should be thinking about real people. We should say, I want to help this person not because they're an abstraction, but because they are a real person. Now, does that mean that we can only help people who are local to us? It doesn't. We can help people through charitable agencies or governmental agencies, but it's not enough to simply fire and forget. We can't simply write a check and forget about it, because they're real people. They're not programs. They're not abstractions. They're real people, and so it's on us to see if we're having the right result. It's like, yes, I gave some money, but then I forgot all about it. That's not the goal. The goal is Lazarus needs some food, and he needs some medicine. So we should be looking at our results. We want to actually do good and not just make ourselves feel better. So we want to do good. The second application is to think about this not just from a lens of consumption. Our society is a consumer society, and it's the default way we look at any problem. Does that person have enough to eat? And Jesus is very clear. That's the first step. Does someone have enough to eat? He tells us in Matthew 25. He says in a parable, he talks about the judgment at the end of the age, and he says the king will say to the people on his left, right or left, he says, "I was hungry, and you didn't give me food to eat. I was thirsty, and you didn't give me anything to drink. I was a stranger, and you didn't welcome me. I was naked, and you didn't give me clothes to wear. I was sick and in prison, and you didn't visit me." Jesus says, absolutely, we totally have to start with the basic necessities of life. But in our culture, that's where we leave it too often. We think in terms of consumption and not in terms of producing. But we are made in God's image, and God is a creative God. We need outlets for the creativity that God has put in us. So it's important that we have the ability to actually produce things. In the letter to the Ephesians, Paul says this. He says, "Thieves should no longer steal." And I have to, just as a little side comment, I love the idea that in that church, in the Ephesian church, there either was somebody who was a thief, or Paul knew that they knew people who were thieves and could explain to them that they should no longer steal. And we would say, yes, thieves definitely should no longer steal. That good, right? And then he says they should go to work. And we, absolutely, I'm with you, Paul. But then he says, why? Is it just so they can have the things to eat, just so that they can have food, just so they can have something to drink or clothes? He says, no. He says they should use their hands to do good, so they will have something to share with someone who is in need. Paul is saying it's important to people. It's important to us as humans to have the ability to actually make a contribution, to actually help to grow the pie so that there's more to share with others. He says, even a thief, I think a lot of us, we'd be satisfied if the guy quit stealing. But Paul says, no, he's not just somebody who needs to change where he gets his food. He needs to turn the arrow around. Instead of consuming things, I take what's not mine. Instead to say, I produce things and I contribute them to the pie that we all can share from. So it's not just about consumption. And we need to think, do the solutions that we have to offer, do they lend themselves to more than just consumption? Do we allow people to do more than consume? I was thinking about this. It says that thieves should no longer steal. I was thinking, as you know, I did prison ministry some years ago, and I asked myself, can a thief in our society do something useful when he gets out of prison? Or is he going to be pretty much impossible to find work? Will he be able to do something with his hands? Will he be able to find a job? Are we, as we put him in prison for doing something that is wrong, are we enabling him to develop the skills that will actually enable him to do something with his hands? Or are we simply warehousing him, hoping that he'll magically get better with time? So we need to ask ourselves, are we enabling people to overcome their background? How do we feel about background checks? How do we feel about the loss of privileges that comes with felony convictions? What do we do about someone who goes to prison and doesn't have a high school degree? How many jobs require a high school diploma? Are we helping people get a GED? Are we helping them to learn skills, useful skills that they can use when they get outside? These are questions we should be asking ourselves, because Paul says even a thief should be able to work with his hands. And so we need to ask those questions. And I know not everybody who's poor was a thief. Not everybody who's poor has been to prison. But there's 2 million people in our prisons today. And there's almost 5 million people who are either on parole or on probation. And I'm kind of a simple guy, and I think if you can help 2 million here and 5 million there, then eventually you might actually make a dent in some of the problems in our society, and then multiply that by their families. How much of a difference would that make in their families? So we need to ask ourselves, are we simply thinking about, there, I've given you some food, you're in prison and you get fed every day. Is that our mentality? Are we simply meeting people's basic needs, or are we giving them an opportunity to be part of our society, to actually contribute to our society? Got 2 more. I'm gonna try and make this as quick as I can. So the next question is what is the role of government? Last week we looked at the civil authority, and we talked about how it has an authority. It's part of God's economy, but also we as citizens in a republic, we have a role in the government. We are the government. We are the king. And so what is the role of government? And there is a role for government, but if the government doesn't do it, that doesn't relieve us of the obligation. If Lazarus is outside of our house and the government is not doing what it needs to do, then we still have the obligation, and Christians have. In the 4th century, the Roman emperor was a man named Julian, and he was trying to revive the old pagan religions. And he was frustrated because there were all these Christians. By then, Christianity had grown and become the largest religion in the Roman Empire. And it frustrated him because he wanted to, kind of, let's go back to the good old days. And what frustrated him is he said everybody knew that the Christians took care of the poor better than the pagans. He said everybody knows this. It's common knowledge. They take care of the poor. And he was the government. So can the government do something? Absolutely it can, but we can't depend on it doing something. We need to be ready to step in if it doesn't. So why should the government do it? Well, we see this throughout the Old Testament. This is part of the kingly role. This is part of what governments are designed to do. In Psalm 72, we read this: "Let the king bring justice to people who are poor. Let him save the children of those who are needy, but let him crush oppressors." So not just take care of the poor, but take care of, punish people who oppress the poor. So this is a proper role of government. And not only that, there's a role for taxes. In the book of Deuteronomy, we read this: "Every 3rd year, you, the people, must bring the 10th part of your produce from that year and leave it at your city gates. Then the Levites, who have no designated inheritance like you do, along with the immigrants, orphans, widows, who live in your cities, they will come and get enough to live on." Well, yes, they will. But more than that, they will feast until they are full. So in the book of Deuteronomy, there's the picture here is one of a generous social safety net, not a bare minimum social safety net, but a generous one, so that the poor can actually feast. So we should do that. We need to be careful. When Julian was talking about the Christians, Christianity had no role in government. But then the next 1,600 years have happened, and Christians have learned that it's very easy, once you get in charge of the government, to trample on people who don't share your faith. And so if we as Christians advocate for a certain policy, we have to appreciate some people will not be coming from our same perspective. And so we should exercise that role carefully, realizing not everybody shares our thinking on a particular topic. But we also need to realize that the government is a blunt instrument. What I mean by that is this. I was reading a story about a single mom. She's living in, this is in the United Kingdom, and she lived in a council estate. That's what they call a housing project in England. She lives in a council estate, and the social worker who was working with her, as he dug into her situation and tried to figure out what was going on, they figured out that the root of all of her problems is that she'd gone heavily into debt to buy a big screen TV. She had the biggest TV in the entire housing project, and she would not envision any other path forward except to have that TV. And the reason was because she had a teenage son, and that TV gave her son status. And other kids would come to their apartment and they would play video games there. And she was utterly convinced that it kept him out of gangs. Now, I don't want a tax system where every welfare mom can buy a TV that's bigger than mine. But if I knew that mom and I heard her story, I'd take her to Costco myself. And I know there are people in this church, there's a lot of people in this church who wouldn't hesitate to do the same thing. Because the government can't adapt to that situation. They can't hear that story and realize why, in this case, actually the TV is exactly what she needs. So we build our systems and we build our programs with kind of the least common denominator approach to people's needs. So the government certainly has a role, but the government is a blunt instrument. And lastly, let me say this. We need to be careful when we advocate for the poor. We need to be very careful. And the reason is not because the poor don't need advocacy. God knows they do. We see that, again, throughout the Hebrew Scriptures. We see that the poor, that people are commended for advocating for the poor. They do need an advocate. The problem is, it's very easy for us to use our advocacy not on their behalf, but on our own, to advance our own agenda. And there's a story that's very, very instructive, very disturbing, and it comes from John's biography of Jesus. Jesus got his feet anointed by a woman. She anointed his feet with very expensive perfume. And the disciples had a kind of a fit. They couldn't believe that happened. And we read in Matthew's gospel that the disciples complained, and we read in Mark's gospels that some of the disciples complained. But in John, we find out who really instigated, who started that complaining. It was Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, the one who would betray him, who complained, "This perfume was worth a year's wages. Why wasn't it sold and the money given to the poor?" He said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. He carried the money bag and would take what was in it. That's what John said. John tells us about Judas, that Judas was leveraging the poor, not to help them, but to advance his own agenda. And I realize people who advocate for the poor aren't always skimming. I think it would be very rare for them to be skimming from the money they make. But they are pursuing their own agenda, or at least the danger is that they would. So the last point here is to be very careful advocating, not because people don't need advocates, but because it's very easy to fool yourself and begin advocating really for yourself. So economic inequality is something that Jesus has taught us about. He's taught us that we who are rich have a positive obligation to help people who have less. And we need to do that if the government is able and willing, and we need to do it if the government isn't. We need to look at the actual results, because we're not talking about programs or abstract people in the abstract. We're talking about real people with real teenage sons, real people who long to eat the crumbs that fall from our tables. Let's pray. Father in heaven, we give you thanks that we are among the rich, that you have blessed us with more than a lot of people can even imagine, and certainly more than we need. Lord, we pray that you would give us generous hearts so that we can be part of the tradition that bothered Emperor Julian so much. We can be part of the Christians who made a difference by helping the poor. Lord, help us to be that generous. Help us to be worthy of the name of Christian, so that we can continue the long and fruitful tradition of Christians helping those who need it. We pray this through Christ our Lord. Amen.